Komal is originally from Ahmedabad, India. Komal Shah migrated to the US in 1991 to study computer science in California. After completing her master's at Stanford, she obtained an MBA from the Haas School of Business at Berkeley, eventually holding positions in the executive suites of Oracle, Netscape, and Yahoo. In 2008, Shah left the tech industry to focus on philanthropic pursuits. She then began developing the Shah Garg Collection with her husband and tech entrepreneur Gaurav Garg, solidifying a vision for the collector's emphasis on women artists in 2014. Today, they are focused on amplifying the voices of women artists and artists of color through the Shah Garg Foundation. Nishad Avari is Head of Department for South Asian Modern plus Contemporary Art at Christie's, New York, with over 18 years of experience in the auction world in India and internationally. Prior to his role as a specialist in South Asian art, Nishad worked with the National Gallery of Modern Art, Mumbai, during the seminal international exhibition Picasso Metamorphoses in from 1900s to 1972. Nishad also contributes articles and essays on South Asian art and artists to exhibition catalogs, scholarly journals, and news publications. A quick note of thanks to JSW for generously supporting our talks program this time, Art Across, in the Art Fair's landmark 15th edition, curated by yours truly. I'm Priya Chauhan. Over to you, Nishad.
Thank you so much, Priya. And thank you so much, Komal, for joining us in Delhi, and to all of you for braving the traffic to be here on a Saturday afternoon. I've had the pleasure and privilege of knowing Komal for a couple of years now, and visiting her and seeing her home and her collection and seeing how it's grown over the years. Over the course of the last 15 years or so, Komal and Gaurav have built what I think, it's awe-inspiring for me, but an inspiring and increasingly focused collection. Today, in addition to continuing to acquiring works that move her, Komal has intentionally set out on an educational and philanthropic journey, I think, keeping in mind the legacy and the future of the collection she's building, and the change that it can inspire in the art world and beyond. And I really want that to be something that we think about in this room and maybe take away from this afternoon. Last year, I visited Komal's most recent presentation of works from her collection called Making Their Mark, a huge exhibition in New York curated by Cecilia Alemani. And I was completely bowled over, to say the very, very least. Not just by how much the collection had grown since the last time I saw it, but by the sort of story it told and the number of different lives it touched and the diversity of people it pulled through the doors. It was absolutely amazing to me. As Priya mentioned, focusing on work by women, the collection includes some names that are familiar to us: Zarina, Reena Banerjee, Vibha Galhotra, and a couple of others. And many, many more that I admire, but several of whom I learned about for the first time while visiting the exhibition and flipping through the publication that accompanied it. But before we get to that, and we will talk about that quite a bit, I wanted to turn back the clock a little and request Komal to sort of trace her journey through the art world, which I hope inspires many people sitting in this room. So if you don't mind, Komal, could you tell us a little bit about your most initial experiences with art, both growing up in Ahmedabad and then sort of mediated through the tech world, if any?
Sounds good. Welcome, everyone. And as Nishad said, thank you for braving through the traffic. It is daunting to actually get to the space, but I was at the art fair 7 years ago, and I must say, it seems to have grown and matured so significantly. So congratulations to the art fair team as well for making it happen. Lots of great surprises, by the way, at the art fair. So it's been a wonderful time over the last few days. And I must say, I loved the textile show, the Ikat show at the Craft Museum yesterday. Back to me, I grew up in Ahmedabad. My father was a textile trader, like many people in Ahmedabad are. And I grew up, I sort of discovered a fondness for computer programming. This is in the early 80s, and I was 15. And I started teaching programming and eventually studied computer science at LD College of Engineering, which is the only college we had back then. And I decided to pursue tech and went to Stanford 33 years ago to study computer science. I was one of 3 women in a class of 100 over at Stanford, which now sounds a little strange, but at that point didn't quite strike me as being different. I'd sort of grown to think of myself as one of them and sort of rise to the occasion, if you will, which we can sort of dissect that at some point, but at that point it was about sort of being equal or better to men. And so that sort of was my my academic and professional journey, and then I've run several $100 million businesses in the tech world, etc. Art wasn't quite part of my psyche, but because of textiles, my father would bring in lots of different fabrics at home. He was a wholesaler and he would sell fabrics to retail merchants. And so we'd sort of, we grew about making garments for our dolls and sort of, thinking about colors and patterns even at that point in time. And I will say that there haven't really been great museums to go to as a culture, at least in the 70s and the 80s. And so it was more sort of, looking at giant temples and the pristineness and the architecture and the detail of design that was sort of pretty influential. But it was also this joy of color that was also, I think, part of sort of what built that visual eye. And eventually, in the US, I started, of course, going to different shows. What I discovered then that my husband and I we both grew up in Ahmedabad, but we had this shared affinity for abstract expressionism. So we'd go to see shows of Rothko or de Kooning or Kandinsky, and that's sort of really what we bonded over as sort of, just voyeurs of art. And we, in fact, went to a show in '99, a gallery show in New York, where the works were incredible. We completely were bowled over. And as we start sort of finding out prices, they said, these are $250,000, which at that point I said, who buys work that's that expensive? It turns out they were late de Kooning works, which are now valued at about $50 million. But, the eye was at least drawn to the right things, or at least things that one liked at that point were credible. And so that sort of was, in some ways, the start of the journey.
That's amazing. And I just want to sort of take it to the next step, which is a story that I know and I like quite a bit, and you'll find out why. But when did the switch flip? When did looking become acquiring, and why?
So I think that there's a story even before this, which is, I was in the tech world, happy, thought that this was going to be my life journey, and that I was actually going to become a big CEO at some point, etc. Not big as in size. But my son was 6 years old then. He's now 21. And he now races cars as a passion, hobby. He'll never be a Formula One racer, but he's very good. And so he actually at 6 years was discovered as having proprioceptive input, which essentially means he could never cross the center line. Like he could not tie shoelaces, he could not ski, he could not bicycle. And so that's when, that genetic programming in women sort of kicked in. And I'd always thought of myself as an equal to all men, so I've managed, various organizations with 99% of the teams being men. But when it actually came down to becoming a mother and sort of taking care of your son, I realized that we were programmed to take care of family. And I felt that if I didn't, at that point, really fully take care of him, that I'd always feel guilty for the rest of my life. And so I tried to go part-time, didn't work. I was very ambitious even at work as part-time, and so sort of just a bad setup. And so I decided to quit. And I plowed myself into the public school foundation, which in the US, are government funded and free to all, but then they are also privately funded from parents. And so the foundation raises money, and so it became my next job. And so then I raised the most money ever for any of these foundations because I sort of like to go deep. And then my dear friend Dipti Mathur, who's an incredible collector, saw how I was going crazy and said, I need to take you to New York to the South Asian Auction Week. And so this was September 2011. And she had set up meetings with Dipanjana Klein and others who were sort of all involved in the art world. And I didn't even know how an auction worked. So I was at the Christie's auction, which is why Nishad is very proud. And Dipanjana Klein, who was sort of, running the South Asian team then, had shown me this one work by Reena Banerjee, who is an Indian diasporic artist, but also considers herself a New Yorker in a lot of ways. And so there was this beautiful work on paper that I immediately fell in love with at sort of the previews. When it came up for auction, nobody was bidding. I didn't even know that one had to register for a paddle. And Dipti had, of course, was sitting next to me, and so then I actually begged her to bid for me. And so the work is still under Dipti's name in the Christie's records, with a side note that I actually own it. And so that sort of effort continued for a few years. One of my other friends, Pamela Joyner, who is now is a very famous collector, also sort of encouraged me to come to a Tate trip to see North American art in New York as well. And that was in 2014. And lo and behold, in a way, I ended up going to the Whitney Biennial with this curator, Mark Godfrey, from the Tate. And that was a turning point for me. I saw these works by two women artists who I didn't know about at all, and certainly not that they were women, Laura Owens and Jacqueline Humphreys, who were showing at the Biennial. They were massive, they were about abstraction, but looking at it in very new, different ways. And that was that moment when the switch flipped. And I said, oh my God, I have to tell my story. I had no idea what that was, but I knew that there were sort of the beginnings of a collection and sort of the obsession that I seem to have now.
Obsession is a great word. But so it's always been that gut reaction first, even with the Reena Banerjee. There was some connection through the visual imagery, and the same way you spoke about textiles and the colors, and it's your eye, and with Laura Owens as well. Can you tell us?
By the way, that's a work by Laura Owens. Yeah. I'll talk more about it if need be. But.
So just talking about your eye, and now that collecting has started, how do you hone that? How do you go out? I mean, are there specific mentors like Mark Godfrey, or maybe we'll talk about how you actually meet the artists, and then they sort of direct your vision a little bit and open it up to so much more. So that's almost like the next step in the journey.
So I was very fortunate to befriend some really good curators. Mark Godfrey from the Tate, Katie Siegel, who's now at SF MoMA, and others. And Mark actually, on one of his trips, so, I'd started to like these artists' work very much, and I decided that they were really going to be central to the story I was going to tell. It so turns out that they were all women. They were sort of my generation, 40s, 50s, 60s. And they were making groundbreaking work. And they were excellent, excellent painters. And so that sort of really, in my mind, was the core. And at that point, and I do not have any sort of academic background in art history, but Mark actually would draw these maps of influences. And it would really become my navigational tool to traverse through the art world, right? So who influenced these artists? Who are they influencing today? Who were sort of peer groups? Because in a way, many of these artists move around in sort of similar networks. And so drawing these networks and sort of then learning about them was really instrumental. Also, as sort of part of this exercise, I started meeting many of the artists. And that's when I realized how the odds were so stacked against women, right? So many of them are exceptional artists, but just were recognized to a much lower degree because they were women. And we can certainly talk more about that, but from that point onwards, it became clear that if I were really going to support if I were going to throw my time and money into something, that it had better make a difference. And so that's eventually how it became about women.
And I mean, it certainly was a time commitment because I think I've seen Komal in more cities than any other collector. She's at every single event. She's out meeting artists. Can you tell us about some of the artists you met early in the journey, and others that they directed you towards, maybe that you wouldn't have found or seen without them?
So I'd say that, so we at this point have in our collection about 200 artists, right? And I want to say 90% being women. And foundationally we support women artists. I might still acquire works by men, but my motto is no white men, right? They've been given enough credit. The world's been fawning over them for a long time. I don't need to do that, right? So that's sort of the thesis of the collection. And I would say half of them probably have come through references, or even more than half. And then certainly a lot of reading has happened, a lot of looking at art fairs, at museum shows, everywhere I can go. And you know, when actually raising kids, it was my refuge. To even go to New York for a day was like a vacation. And even though that meant, you know, being in flights for 15 hours of that whole 24-hour journey, it was still worth it. And so I think it's all of the above.
Yeah, but any particular one that stands out to you that maybe you wouldn't have come across if it wasn't for these networks and introductions?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I will say that a turning point in the collection. So we have the show, which you're seeing images of in New York, called Making Their Mark. And there's an artist who actually has now become the highest grossing artist born in Africa. Her name is Julie Maretu, and her work recently auctioned for about $10 million. And she is exactly my age. Well, she's 9 months younger. She found herself at the bottom of the list in our show. And so in our show, we have 84 artists, all arranged by order, year of birth. And so she found herself in sort of like the bottom 20th percentile, and she was surprised. Okay, now back to your question. You know, as I met sort of artists my age, I sort of started asking them for artists who they were influenced by. And so one of the names that came up was Mary Heilman, right? And Mary Heilman is an artist who's now in her 80s and has been working in Berkeley, California, and then sort of New York, you know, competing with Donald Judd and other artists in that sort of genre, afraid to call herself a painter because that wasn't in at that point, especially for women. And an abstraction certainly was not a woman's domain. So she actually came about because of these artists' referrals. But then I also discovered this huge group of women who are in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, who have such incredible bodies of work behind them and the persistence. They're still making incredible work, but they just haven't seen the recognition. And so that has really become a very important submission of the collection.
And just as you approach them and see them, very often, I think in interviews, it's been said that your approach to collecting is brave. You're not intimidated by attributes like scale, for example, or even traditional silos that we all encounter and battle, like fine arts and craft, for example. Or I think something you described that really stuck with me was projected gender. So can you give us a couple of anecdotes about scale, maybe first? Maybe we talk about the Mary Weatherford.
Oh yeah, right
yeah.
there. Yeah. Right there. So this is an artist called Mary Weatherford, lives in LA. It's 24 feet wide. It's the largest work she's ever made. She was in Kauai during COVID and was looking at these beautiful rainbows. And this is a reflection of what she thinks she saw. And I like scale. I like when women take chances and we make strong muscular works. In my mind, I wanted to show that women can do everything men can and better, right? So scale is something that has often been seen as a differentiator. Craft is another one, but scale for me was very important, and muscularity of work, expressiveness, because in a way it sets us on a level playing field. And so I have a certain penchant for scale. There are several works in our collection that are over 20 feet wide that I had not been able to install in the house, but it was very important to acquire those works. Even though I knew that they didn't fit in the house, I had a sense that I would find a way to make it work eventually. And so in our house, we've been running social experiments. So we'd have all this work installed. We've, at this point, entertained every single museum in the US. And a lot of cases, the trustees would come by and not know who they were looking at. And they'd sort of want to know who the artists were. And they'd ask for a checklist, which we would give them at the end of the tour. And then they'd say, oh, these are all women. And so it was sort of that experiment that was great to do on them, that the works didn't quite tell you what the gender was of the artist, and how then suddenly they were finding that these works were quite excellent and wanted to acquire them. So that was sort of part of the influencing bit that I worked on.
The first Mary Weatherford I saw was in your living room, by the way. Yeah. So the next step really is the foundation. Can you tell us how that started? Was it as a response to the way in which the collection was growing? I mean, now we're thinking of things like legacy and advocacy. So at what stage did you feel the need to create the foundation? And what do you at that time, what did you envision it would do?
So I would love to have said that I'm a very strategic thinker and that I plan 5 years out or 3 years out even. I don't. But the work had been going on for about 12 years, where I had been really surprised that no one was collecting works by these incredible artists because they were women. And so, in a way, sort of, business school principles make you think that these are undervalued assets, right? So, even for a non-art history major like me, I could easily go and sort of look at the work saying they were so incredible that there was no way but up on the valuation. So that sort of made me feel more comfortable with sort of acquiring them at the pace I was. So the collection had sort of just been happening in sort of a breakneck speed in a way. And then Mark Godfrey, who's been my mentor, and he was one of the best curators at the Tate, said, why don't we do a book on your collection? And I thought, the book could perhaps be perceived as a vanity project. Look at my shiny new objects. And he actually convinced me that this was more about encouraging scholarship on the breadth and the depth of women's work. And so we set about on that book. And then Katie Siegel also joined as a co-editor. We recruited 11 writers to write about sort of the various aspects of women's work, including craft. And soon it became a village, and it became this large community that was working on this project. The book launched in May last year. And prior to the launch, we were getting questions about how do you make this collection now accessible to the public. And that really set us up on this show. So in a way, while the foundation was never public until only a year ago, the work had already been happening, but we realized we needed to really galvanize all of our work and have a name to it. And so it's sort of more of the marketing in a way that happened over the last year.
And sort of even before the publication, there were the talks at Stanford, for example, which the foundation supported. Can you tell us a little about that?
So that was another social experiment. And I'm actually going to say something here, sort of unrelated. So in India, I don't think it's been so quantified yet. But in the US, where you would sort of consider it sort of the North Star, only 12% of works acquired by museums in the last 10 years are by women. And we know that women are 51% of the population, and more than 50% of art students graduating are women, right? But when it comes to actual acquisitions, it's 12. So that sort of data point was disturbing. And the second data point that Guardian actually published was that women artists earn 10 cents to the dollar. And it's the lowest in any industry, right? So there are all these various factors going on as well. And so it really strengthened our resolve to bring as much light as we could to the artists. And that really began the journey.
So it's really about advocacy.
Oh, it's totally about advocacy.
sort of.
So the Stanford series, going back, sorry,
Yeah.
I'm being forgetful here, but the Stanford series was really about a social experiment where we call it Artists on the Future. We've had some amazing artists, you know, Linda Benglis, who's now in her 80s, Lorna Simpson, Dana Schutz, etc., speak, Shirin Nishad. We've had a male interlocutor, and so Darren Walker, who heads up the Ford Foundation, which is the biggest foundation in the US, has been the interlocutor twice. The artist is always female, the interlocutor mostly is male, and in a way this is sort of another way of putting women in positions of power. And this has become one of the most popular series where we've never advertised that the artist will always be female, right? But you know, we get 8,000, 9,000 views for each talk online. And at Stanford, when we were hosting it in person, we had 400, 500 people coming to those talks. So in a way, if you don't specify the gender, people will come.
Yeah. And it also, I mean, it's amplifying those voices in addition to
Yes.
advocacy, right? And so then I thought maybe, can you tell us how that sort of thread of amplification continues through making their mark?
So, you know, we had this long debate when we were publishing the book. The book has 136 women artists. And the debate was around the subtitle of the book, which is Art by Women. And we wondered if we should actually go out and say that or not, and if that would hurt or help the book. Eventually we said, you know, we've developed enough confidence in what we're doing to say this is art by women. And the book actually is selling incredibly well, much better than our expectations. And so now it's clear what the foundation does and what the mission is, that it is to support women artists. The show has been actually one of the most successful private shows in the country. And we've extended it by a couple of months. We just had a talk with 3 of the artists in the show, and we had over 1,000 RSVPs. And we actually had to turn people away. There were several people from MoMA who were at the talk who said this is the biggest talk attendance they've seen. And so people are hungry. People want to see other people like themselves on the walls. You know, one of the things that I actually didn't mention earlier was that the show is curated by Cecilia Alemani, who curated the last Venice Biennale. And she ran a social experiment of sorts where 90% of the artists in that Biennale were women. And she and I have been friends for 9 years, and we actually, until about 2 years ago, didn't know how aligned we were in our support. And so when I asked Cecilia if she would curate our shows, she said yes immediately. And she's done a fantastic job at curating the show. So it's great to have such an incredible curator curating the show as well.
I think just to give people a sense, it's across 2 floors. How many works?
So it's about 100 works.
Yeah.
By the way, this orange fiber work you see was made in 1977 by a Swiss artist by the name of Francois Grossen. And not a plug here, but I will say that there are artists now in their 80s, and she's also in her 80s, who have actually now been rediscovered because of the show. So one of them, who's 87 years old, a Native American artist, will be featured very prominently in the Venice Biennale in April. And it is great to be able to make a difference in their careers as well.
And I think that's the perfect segue, because firstly, I want to talk about the show a little bit more. It's going to travel after New York to a couple of places, and I'll let Komal tell you about that. But just this idea of the future, and making sure that what we're doing is not fleeting or not limited to our time. How do you see that playing out in relation to the collection?
Where do I start? So the show will travel to BAMFA, which is the Berkeley Art Museum on campus. It will also travel to the Kemper Museum in St. Louis. And we are in talks with the American Federation of the Arts, which is an organization that actually just travels shows. So my sense is that it will go to 4 or 5 other venues by the time we're done. And so it's a story that will continue to live way beyond the starting point. There have been so many people, not just women, who've come to the show and cried, press people who've actually come 3 or 4 times, bringing in their mother, bringing in their friends, bringing in their daughters. And it's incredible to see that joy and that commitment, if you will. And so I think we want to keep doing that as best as we can. I also do feel that eventually we will have to create our own space that is a vibrant, safe space where we not just have great shows, but where we have discourse, we have research, we have discussion. It's a vibrant place where women feel like they are the leading part of the universe, right? And I'm very confident that we can do it, because I do feel that once we remove our blinders on gender, people will really see how amazing these artists are. It's just about removing the blinders. And I call my role as being a seducer, right? So I want to put up great things on the walls so that when people see it, they actually do see the greatness, right? And that's really my job. I'm not about shouting at rooftops and screaming, why are we not equal to all men? But it's more about influencing, and that's what I can do as a collector.
I was just going to get to that, actually. When I visited the show, there were student artists who were there who were actually making work in the space, which I haven't seen before in a private exhibition. But we've talked about amplifying the voices of the artists and the continuity over time. But in terms of other collectors, and you just touched on that a little, it's this inspiring through what you do rather than shouting it from the rooftops. What would you like to see in the, say, medium-term and long-term future with other private collectors?
I would love to get to a point where I don't even have to say that this is a collection that's focused, right? Because if it's about 51% of the world, how in the hell can it be focused, right? It really does not need, when there have been so many collections that are all male artists, no one has said this is an all male collection, right? But somehow I'm being singled out for it being so focused on women. And I hope that it just becomes the norm that we collect artists as we love. And I will say that, several artists who we have collected, Simone Lee, for example, who, was in the Venice Biennale and had the whole US pavilion, we've seen remarkable strides in many of their careers. And I see that in India too, starting to happen significantly. But, I've been racking everybody's brains, asking questions on who are the big Indian female modernists. And when I sort of see the numbers of male versus female modernists that are on sort of tips of people's tongues, the ratio is a little,
Skewed.
very skewed.
Yeah.
And it sort of makes me wonder why is that the situation everywhere? So if we can start reciting women artists' names in the same breath, right, as an M.F. Hussain, right, or a Mark Rothko, I think that's important. The show will travel to many university museums because our real interest is to, I won't use the word brainwashing lightly, but to really influence younger generations, to see all these women on the walls and just become used to the idea that, yeah, they belong on the walls. And so that's sort of really what we're trying to do. We also have partnerships now with the New York Public School Department of Education. And so we've had basically almost every classroom from the public schools come out. All of the visual arts teachers have come out. And they are making work, having their students make work inspired by the women artists on the walls. And so in my mind, that's sort of a way of ingraining further in them.
I think education and getting it out there at the youngest possible level is very, very important. I have this little note that says systemic change, and I think that's really what's happening. That's what is coming down the pipeline. But do you ever feel like it's this weight on your shoulders, having to be the one re-evaluating the canon. What do you think the setbacks are in a way, if any?
So, perhaps I'm not very, what's the right word, thoughtful about things. I follow my instinct. I follow my passion. I follow my beliefs. And this is something that perhaps my father actually ingrained in me, to be fearless. And so I just do things that I believe in. And I was telling Nishad the other day that when we opened up our show in New York, as a collector, you can privately go build whatever you want, but once you're in the public eye, it's a whole different ballgame, right? And it's nerve-wracking to put yourself out there, just as many artists would feel. But the response has been overwhelmingly positive, 100% positive. We've got so many great remarks in our books, etc. as well. I will say that if you really follow your passion, do the right things, there is interest. People will see the right thing as well. But you have to keep at it. And I think that for me, the show is one aspect, but we'll continue to find other ways to continue the discourse. And, eventually I was talking about our own institute. We also support museum acquisitions of many of these artists. So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. I personally don't think about weight on my shoulders. I just do it because I believe in it, and I feel like the others will follow.
And several of the works are already long-term promised gifts,
yes,
for
they
example.
Are. Yes.
So we at least know where those are going. But I think that's a good point to sort of open it up to the audience, if that's good timing, and you don't mind.
Sure, not at all.
Any questions?
This is very real that you are supporting womenhood. You're enjoying it, you're taking pride in it. But from an artist's point of view, from someone who's very interested in art, don't you think you're boxing something? It's fine that you're collecting the data, you're doing this, you're doing a lot of things. I'm not asking a question being a man. I'm asking a question being an art lover. So, because you are representing the whole society now, you're sitting in a very, very big chair at the moment, and you have a lot of power in you, especially in terms of respecting the art fraternity and art world. So, don't you think you're gauging the good thing and bad thing, or you're opening one door, you're closing one door, you're collecting data, it's fine. But focusing on that thing, I know you got the question, but it's very emotional, very sensational, beyond words.
Okay, so I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question perfectly, but I'll try. For the longest time, women were ambivalent about being in sort of women-only collections, right? In fact, one of the artists who I absolutely adore and who's one of the smartest women I know, a German artist, Charlene von Heil, said, you should always have men in the collection to show how women are really way better than those men. So yes, we do have some good men in the collection. I do sort of think about so many, important collections of the past where there have been no women, and no one apologized, no one made a stinker about it, right? So why the hell should they make a stinker if I course correct in my own way? And this is with my resources, with my time, with my beliefs. And what's also interesting, by the way, to see is that, an artist like Cecily Brown, right, who will never quote any women artists as an influence on her, was very proudly in our last conversation 10 days ago in New York as a proud participant and very excited to be part of this show and the momentum, right? So I think that, if you tell the right narrative and are actually explicit about course correcting, then I think it's it's important, and I think it's a show that will make a difference to how people collect. I don't expect more people to be collecting only women, but at least the fact that there are so many great artists out there that they should absolutely look at is what I hope to achieve, right? And so yeah, I mean, this is, it's a collection that's really glorifying these incredible artists who've been overlooked. That's the way of looking at it, as opposed to saying they're by women artists.
I have a very silly question, if I may.
Oh, that's good.
So when you started collecting early on, did you think about conservation? And when you bought a work you knew would not fit in your house, how did you manage and think about, what do you do now? I love this work, I've bought it, now what? And how do I preserve it so it doesn't get damaged in the future as well?
So I don't know if you saw this, but there was a work with like 2 women figures in them. It's sort of a palace wall. I don't know if it's gone through the rotation, because I have a funny story too.
That one. Yeah.
So this is a work created by an artist called Firale Baez, who's from Haiti. And this work was made for the MoMA window. So MoMA New York has this thing where every 6 months they have a new artist who puts up an installation. It's about 30 feet wide, I think. I could be wrong. And so the artist was making the work in her studio. I chanced upon it. And I said, if MoMA doesn't acquire the work, I just want to make sure you know that I'm interested. The next day I got a call from the dealer saying the work was available. Klaus, who's actually here, Klaus Biesenbach, had actually commissioned it, but whatever. It was MoMA's loss, and I acquired it in 2018. It sat in storage for 5 years. And this is the first time it actually has now come out of its packaging. And so we were very nervous around it. But as I said, for me, it's important to acquire important A+ works. And then I'll figure out, I know that I will be able to show them in some context later on. But the opportunity of acquiring this work wouldn't have otherwise come about.
And in this case, at least, the context will keep changing
It
as the show
totally
evolves.
keep changing. So by the way, the show has a third of our collection. 50% of our, no, not 50, a third of the collection is in storage, a third is in the house. And that at some point my math is not adding up. But about 10% is on loans to museums. So rough percentages.
Hi, so I'm just curious to know how many Indian artists are in your collection?
Fair question.
And if you have because you are from India, and if you have a bias towards maybe South Asian women artists in general, just asking.
Yeah, of course, that's a fair question. And in fact, I'm surprised it actually came up at this point. But, I have lived in the US for about more than 2/3 of my life at this point. So in a way, initially when I started looking at collecting where I was, it was about these women that I intuitively connected to the work. And, along the way, there have been women, so Zarina Banerjee, Suchitra Mathai, and she is more sort of, based in the US, but Indian origins. Shazia Sikandar have made, Bhasha Chakrabarti have all made their way into the collection. And in fact, this is actually one of those moments, quite honestly, where I'm earnestly now wanting to learn in terms of now sort of combining the greatness of the two continents, if you will. But I need to learn a lot right now before I jump in. And it takes me a while. Any suggestions are welcome, by the way.
Hello, my name is Hema Guha. I am a visual artist from here. This is not actually related to your collection, but are you aware that the National Gallery of Modern Art, Delhi, has put up many retrospective exhibitions, but they are all of male artists. I have not seen them coming up with any female exhibition of female artist works. Are you aware?
So I wasn't aware, though you're right, that the only shows I've seen are of, like, Jitesh Kalat was the last one I saw 7 years ago. Who would you like to see in an NGMA show? I'm turning the question around to you.
No, there are many women. If suppose they had put up a show of Mr. K.G. Subramaniam, there are women artists of the same stature also. I feel that they could have also been taken up.
Names?
I don't want to say like that.
Okay.
It's for the researchers, they can find out. But that doesn't mean that they can't put up works of younger artists also.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Even Jitesh is younger only.
Correct. And I think that that's really where collectors, curators all need to make a conscious attempt. You know, I've said this multiple times, but equity and excellence are not mutually exclusive, right? And so sometimes people will say, oh yeah, you just start bringing in a woman because she's a woman, not because she's good. And that to me is there's a huge fallacy in that argument. And there are, as I said, excellent artists who are women, so it shouldn't be that hard to find. But you do have to make a conscious attempt.
I'm happy that you are collecting women artists' works, and that also not just Indian artists, you know, others also.
Thank you.
They are all women. So
If I ever
that
meet
doesn't-
anybody at NGMA, I will definitely communicate that feedback.
Okay, thank you.
But I think-
they would listen to you, possibly.
I can try.
In this context, I think maybe NGMA is not the platform where immediate change happens, but there are spaces where it is happening, and I think that's super encouraging. I mean, we've seen, yeah, exactly. But luckily, we're having this flourishing of private museums, for example, in the country. We've seen amazing shows by Zarina, by Nasreen, for example. An exhibition that traveled to Madrid and New York was one of the opening shows of the Met Breuer building, which was an incredible moment for a South Asian artist of any genre.
And that was because there was a curator who believed
Exactly.
in those artists. And I think that NGMA needs to hire better curators. Well, I'm going to be gone, so I can say things that I want.
So, yeah, hi. I have
Hi.
a question. Thank you for a very insightful and interesting conversation. So I'm curious to know that, you know, as part of your journey of like art patronage and the kind of works that I see, you spoke about the fact that you like to pick artists who have a more muscular vocabulary of art, and you know that comes across beautifully in the images. As part of the curatorial, what are the kind of dialogues and conversations between the artists? Because again, there are people from different continents and from different age groups. You mentioned like artists from 60s, 70s, and 80s as well. So is there any focus on intergenerational allyship, kind of regional cross dialogue between the artists who you've picked, whose works you've picked, or is that something?
It is absolutely the case, though I wouldn't call it all designed that way when we started collecting. But, you know, as I said, a lot of artists came through referrals, which is about teachers, influencers, etc. But then, you know, we were, in fact, Mort is right here, and we were talking about Cranbrook, and a specific artist, Nellie Seth now, who had been to Cranbrook, and there's a Colombian artist who also went to Cranbrook, and is one of their sort of poster students, Olga de Amaral, who's also, of course, now in the Venice Biennale, but those are sort of moments, and there's Toshiko Takai, so quite a few artists who went to that particular institution. And so sort of also looking at that lineage has been incredible, right? So in my mind, I sort of look at various points of time and place as well for sort of knowledge.
And then I think the way they're set up in the show and the sort of conversations that Cecilia has curated between the works are new discoveries, given what exists in the collection.
You know, and one thing I didn't mention, even though you'd asked about it, is that, you know, textile and crafts in all parts of the world have always been looked upon as sort of secondary, right? So they have never belonged to the canon of fine art. And the canon of fine art was painting and sculpture, which is what men generally did. And so one of the conscious attempts that we've made is to really put craft and textiles at the same level as muscular sculpture or big paintings. And really just turn that around on its head as well. And I really do feel that the more we see things just done, it'll become part of our natural way of thinking, right? So that's sort of what I mean by seduction and influence, that you really just have to do it and show it.
Hi, Komal. Firstly, congratulations. This seems like an amazing exhibition, and kudos, and look forward to your space, and which I'm sure eventually would happen. So I came in a little late, but my question is kind of focused around India and South Asia, and I was just wondering, in terms of acquisition and plans for that, and in terms of deep collections, and if you had any considerations, and now that you already are a collector, and I think from what I'm seeing over here, it's like almost a platform for global feminism. What is your plan for India, and where would you begin, and how would that journey, kind of translate? Any thoughts?
Well, so I've answered that question, so I'll keep it brief, but
Sorry.
I was mentioning that I'm here to learn. And I feel that as sort of living in the US, which I do now consider home, it is a melting pot of many cultures that come together. So I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm also looking at Middle Eastern artists as well, right? And also Latin American artists, and sort of expanding the geographical reach of the collection. Certainly India has a very special place, and I want to learn as much as I can, but I never go by a plan in terms of time. I need to learn, I need to feel the love, and then I'll embark on it.
Hi, Shreya over here. First of all, fantastic initiative. I think what you're doing is amazing. I have a question, and this comes from my own journey of being an art student at art school. And I think when we're in art school, I don't know about the West, I can only speak about India because I studied in India. We're always made to idolize male painters like they are the greatest, And we sort of lose out on seeing how great female artists are. Like, I fell in love with Cecily Brown and Tracy Emin and Joan Mitchell, all because I studied them myself, not because I was taught this. So I do believe that this system and this line of thinking needs to change from a grassroots level. So my question's kind of a two-parter. I also joined in late, so I don't know if you've already addressed this, but would you like to do something to be a patron for young artists, or do something in the educational sector to change this thought process? I think that would be fantastic if you can contribute, considering what you've done so far. So that's my question.
I'll be honest that sometimes these great questions have led me to think more. Like, if I had all a 10-pronged approach, then it would be great, but I don't. In the US, there are several institutions like Yale and Skowhegan, etc., that are really on the leading edge, that we're talking to very seriously. And more in terms of how do we help get them sort of a longer lifespan, right? Because if you think about the Yale MFA program, which is like the #1 program in the world at this point, the number of students that are graduating are equal, right, in terms of gender. But somehow not all of the women artists or students make it through the pipeline. So I think that there's a lot to be done on that end, and that we are certainly talking pretty actively. I think on sort of the patronage of younger women and students, etc., I'm pretty sure that that's going to happen, whether it's us or whether it's us combining with institutions. And that's why I say that there's just so much in the ecosystem that needs to be worked on. I mean, simple things like Firale, who made this enormous painting, was finally one of these young artists who was really confident about herself in terms of even articulating what she did, and also weaving in her own personal narrative into the work. Women have been so inassertive, so afraid to talk about them and to talk about their work and their influences. And the assertiveness is something that we all need training, right? So I feel like there's just so many different angles, work-life balance, right, that we need to work on as well, and sort of like gallery's acceptance of that. So I feel like there will be a lot of initiatives coming out. I honestly don't know the timelines.
Hello. Um, Hi, first of all, I just wanted to say this is deeply inspiring and thank you for doing what you're doing. I think it's just, as a woman, I can say that. And you've spoken a lot about how we see gender play out in the space of art and for artists, but I was just wondering, does the same thing apply in the space of curation and collecting and, just in the space of patrons? And because, I mean, from my personal experience and understanding of society, women are frivolized across strata, right? So, what's been your experience of that?
You know, it's funny that I was talking to a curator, a very good curator out of this museum called MoMA PS1, and we were just talking about how, well, in terms of curators, we're even, right? At least in the US. I do not know, I will not sort of profess to know anything about the Indian world at this moment, but in terms of directors, it's about 20%, right? So what it takes to become a director somehow escapes women, right? And whether it's the countless hours of work or the networking or the fundraising, I don't know where there's a breakdown, but there is. I will also say that much as, you know, we have had a fairly good presence of women curators, not all of them support women artists, because everyone's wanting to belong in this sort of boys' network, right? Which is what I did as a tech person, right? I didn't see it any different in being one of the men, right? And so sometimes they actually don't take on the responsibility of supporting other women. And I think that it's changing now. With the same thing with collectors, right? Men used to make most of the collecting decisions. Initially, I used to be one of the odd people out. And I've had an incredibly supportive husband of 25 years. But it's changing now. Women are taking power. You know, no one's going to give you power. You just have to take it.
I think that's a great note to end on. I'm sorry if there were any more questions. I think Komal's going to be around for a little bit, if I may volunteer. But that's all we have time for in the session. Thank you so much for joining us.